welcome to a new episode of Tell Muses, a podcast by storytellers, with storytellers, for storytellers. And today, Simona and I are very pleased to have with us, all the way from the UK, the wonderful, the brilliant, the unbeatable Jason Bach.
Good morning. Good
Yeah,
morning. Hello,
welcome.
everybody. Hi. Lovely. Thank you very much for asking me to be here. Lovely to be here. Nice to chat to you guys.
Oh, we love to have you here. So, Jason, for the people who know you and the people who don't know you, would you like to tell us a few things about who Jason Bach is?
Sure. So I'm a storyteller. I'm a performance storyteller, and I earn almost all of my money as a storyteller. I did my first professional show, so that's one that people actually bought tickets for, 10 years ago this year, and I have been a full-time storyteller since 2019, when I gave up my very lucrative corporate job to become a storyteller, ready for 2020 and ready to take my tour around the UK. And then things obviously didn't happen like that, but I ended up doing a lot of stuff online instead. And almost 6 years on, I'm still here, still telling stories. So it worked somehow.
Jason, how did it all start for you? So, how did you get interested in stories and storytelling? Did you grow up in a storytelling family? Did you start it with books? How did it all start for you?
I think there's probably a few different points in my life that have kind of added up to this. My parents were both educators, they were both teachers. My mother was a school teacher, my father was in adult education. But they were both very arty people and used to perform, and they used to do performed readings of Charles Dickens stuff in costume. So I was surrounded by a very performative environment. I started playing Dungeons and Dragons when I was 13, and that really was a thing for me. I never liked being the player so much. I preferred being the games master. So I liked to write the stories and create the stories, and it was always less about the dice and more about a collaborative storytelling experience. But I think it was in the late 1990s I went to a festival called Beyond the Border, which unfortunately, sadly, has just stopped. But at the time, it was an international storytelling festival which was held in a castle and the grounds of a castle in Wales. And so you left your tent and walked along the cliff tops with fairy lights and banners into the grounds of a castle that came down in terraced gardens towards the sea. And it was absolutely magical. And I thought, brilliant, this is what I want to do. This is absolutely what I want to do. I want to do this. And then 20 years passed. And eventually, after doing little bits of storytelling and going lots of festivals and performing bits here and there and doing various things, I found a storytelling club down in Southampton and properly just I went straight in and started telling stories. I haven't looked back since then, really.
Brilliant. And also, I think it's very reassuring for many storytellers who are just starting out to hear that even some of the great storytellers, some of the people that we may look up to that are very famous as you are,
Ooh.
have taken 20 years
Yeah.
to decide to do that. There's
Absolutely.
time.
Life just got in the way. In fact, I remember on one morning after going to one of those festivals, I was leaving with some friends, and it was the Monday morning at the end of the festival. A friend of mine was driving. So it would have been Monday afternoon because I'd had a few beers, and as we all drove off in a car full of people, everybody jammed in, I loudly declared that I was going to buy a harp and become a bard. And then my friend said, "Do you know how much harps cost?" And then I thought, oh, okay. And then a friend of mine said, "I've got a mandolin that I don't use. Would you like to borrow that?" And so, yeah, absolutely. At that moment, I intended that my immediate life would be becoming a strolling bard and storyteller. But then, things happened. I did other things in life, and moved around the UK and became a father and worked for large corporate companies and things like that. But even when I was actually doing sort of business consultancy and digital consultancy was what I used to do, there was a lot of storytelling in my work. And I used to be the one that we would always get to do the presentations, to do the workshops, to get people working together, to be the one standing up in front of people, because I was always perfectly comfortable standing up and talking in front of people. I wasn't nervous, and I still get nervous. I still get stage fright, but I was happy to do it and I enjoyed it. And I think because I enjoyed it, then other people enjoyed it as well.
Now that Simona mentioned the fact that, young people who aspire to become storytellers, who look up to you, can draw courage from how long it took you to reach your final decision. This is a debatable subject because we had Liz Severe to start this series with. And Liz's advice towards people who are interested to delve into storytelling was, do not leave the morning job. So
Yes. Don't leave the job, was that? Don't leave the day job.
exactly.
Yeah.
I just think it's important to stress that you may have become a famous storyteller now, but you really worked hard for it. It's not like you woke up one morning and everybody was calling you to events, right? You really put some effort in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very nice, by the way, that you keep describing me as famous. It's very nice. Thank you very much. It makes me feel very, very nice. I don't know how famous I really is a storyteller. I don't know, but thank you. But yeah, absolutely. I absolutely couldn't give up the day job to do things. I think the thing for me was that because of who I am, and probably the way my head works, that I've often worked in a freelance role or contract roles or have been self-employed as well for many years. So for me, that idea of doing things and having to make things happen myself was quite familiar to me, and that probably helped. Because when it came to 2020, at the time I was going to be doing a tour of Egyptian myths and legends, and I had a number of different places around England that I was going to be doing that. And some of that was just, again, me contacting places, going to places and putting the work in to actually get people to say, yeah, okay, you can come and tell stories here, and making myself a website and a Facebook thing. It's all that extra stuff in the background, not directly to do with learning or telling the stories. But those are the things that have meant that I've been able to put my own shows on and to do stuff. I've never been funded. I've always been self-funded and self-produced. And I think that's probably from the attitude and the angle that I come from. But over lockdown, when I know a lot of my colleagues weren't sure about doing things online or just sort of thought, well, we'll wait and see what happens, or I have to give up now, I had no option. I suddenly had a mortgage to pay and a son to keep and a cat to feed. And, I needed the money. And at the time in the UK, being self-employed meant that I wouldn't have got any social benefits because I'd been self-employed and it was my own fault. So I had to do something. And so over the first 6 months of lockdown, I counted it up once, and I did 107 shows during that first 6 months. Once I'd worked out how Zoom did what many of us now feel is quite natural, I advertised and put on shows. Even if I wasn't earning very much to begin with, I was doing lunchtime shows pretty much every day, just a little 15-minute kids story for kids and their families at home, or even for adults who were having to work from home. There were regular couples who would come on with their cameras off and have their lunch break doing their jobs they had to do from home. And then the evenings I was either doing my own shows or I was doing collaborations with people, or occasionally I got invited to do other things. But at the end, it certainly wasn't sustainable. But it did mean that not only did I earn just about enough money to pay the mortgage, but it also actually meant I grew my audience. And because it was online, it was an audience that was across the UK and actually across the world. And I also got some lovely presents at Christmas time as well, which was nice, because it actually built up a community of people who regularly come on. It wasn't just people who came on for one show. They would come on every day or, every week or so to listen to my stories and hear my voice, they said, which was a comfort when they were working from home and on their own, some of them. So for me, whilst horrible things were happening in the world, lockdown worked out quite well for me and actually helped me, I think, but only because I put the effort in and was telling almost every day.
And you have a huge repertoire of different genres of stories you tell, right?
Yes and no. I think I have probably quite a wide repertoire, but that kind of suits the eclectic nature, I think, of my head. But I also find that I can learn stories very quickly and perform them with using a lot of improvisational techniques and reacting to audiences or reacting to the moment rather than necessarily perhaps learning the script, as it were. But then I also forget them very quickly as well, because I found, like the lockdown example, it's all short-term memory. So when my partner said to me, oh, you should tell that story you wrote about the spider in the attic. I said, what story? I have no idea. I have no memory of this place. And it was a story I had written. And then when I went back and looked, I went, oh yeah, there was that one. Oh, I remember now. Yeah, oh, great, I like that. But I'd actually written a story and then performed it because I'd only done it once and then I had to learn something else. My brain got very used to kind of like, right, we'll take this on really quickly, but then we can lose it because he won't need it again. If he does, he can rehearse it again. So it was like part of my brain that had kind of gone, well, do you know what? We'll use this extra space just for learning quickly. And that's great for doing lots of things at lots of different times. It means I'm not limited to doing one show for a long period of time or one collection of stories and then having to stop and then start again.
But I'm sure that some of the stories, the ones that, speak deeply to you, will remain somewhere in your brain, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yes. It's not that my brain is currently empty because I don't have to. It's not. It's not just. Yeah. Yeah. There is. Yeah. There's definitely favourites and ones that I like to tell over and over again, and other ones that are frustratingly sort of think I have I can sort of think, oh, that's really good, but it's too. I can't quite remember it all. Then that's a nice little inspiration for me to go and sort of re-research something and spend some more time with that story.
Or even create a new version of a story you already told.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, recently I was doing a series of shows for February for alternative Valentines. So I was telling dark stories for Valentines, which were definitely stories for grown-ups. Nothing too weird or nothing mucky in it, but definitely kind of grown-up stories. And there was a story that I wrote called The Portrait, inspired by various different things to do with early 20th century resurgence in spiritualism and ceremonial magic. There's a little bit of the portrait of Dorian Gray in there, and there's bits and pieces of sort of things. And I've been reading a lot of Lovecraft recently. H.P. Lovecraft, he writes, sort of a gothic and cosmic horror about the nameless things that come from the stars or come from deep under the sea. And this was a sort of a nice little sort of turn of the 19th, 20th century gothic horror story is not really right. Twister story, I suppose, in which the bad guy gets his comeuppance. And I told it first online. Usually when I tell things online, everybody's on mute and it's a very quiet response. So I'm telling to the little green dot, I'm telling to the camera. And it went in a particular way. And I thought, oh, okay, that's quite nice. That was its first outing. And then I told it the day after live to a live audience. And I suddenly got a reaction that I didn't expect. And people were sort of laughing at the bits where, oh, we know what's coming up, oh, he's going to get his... And suddenly it became something much more kind of, oh, okay, yeah, okay, let's play with this. Let's play along with this. And rather than it being a sort of, oh dear, then this happened, then that happened, then this, and oh, at the end, it was much more humorous in its darkness, and the audience were enjoying guessing, what was coming over the horizon, seeing what was going to happen to the bad guy at the end. So it changed.
So, Jason, you told us that you tell stories that you write. And
Yeah.
also, well, I heard you tell stories from, for example, the Nordic myths and legends. Are there any specific genre of stories that you like telling? Or do you have any favorite myths? Because I saw you doing lots of Scandinavian myths
Yeah.
and legends.
I
I
sort of fell
know.
into that. I like dark stories. I like dark tales because I think the world is not an awful place, but it can be an awful place. We all well know there are lots of awful things happening all over the world. But being able to listen to dark stories and horror stories or things where gruesome things happen to people is a nice cathartic way of, I think, of enjoying the darkness of the world whilst keeping it at arm's length, like a child waking in the morning to realize that it's all only a dream and actually everything's lovely in life. I like the darker stories, but I fell into telling Norse and Viking stuff because well, two reasons really. Once I was at a storytelling club getting ready to tell a story, and another one of the storytellers, and I didn't really know much about Viking or Nordic myths, but one of the other storytellers turned around to me and she mentioned something about a particular myth, and I said, oh, I don't know that one. And she kind of looked at me, shocked, and said, call yourself a Viking? And I thought, no, I don't. But I'm almost 2 meters, I'm 6'4", so I'm almost 2 meters tall, which is not always obvious on screen. And I've quite often got a big hairy beard and things, and so I think people automatically assume that somehow I'm a Viking, or that I like to tell Viking myths. I know, Despina, you and I did an evening of Asgard versus Olympus, where we matched Nordic and Greek mythology, which is quite fun. We did a bit of comparative stuff there. But actually, my first Viking stories came from an audience member bought me a present, and it was a guy who'd been to a few of my shows, and a very nice sort of quiet, humble gentleman. And he walked up to me at the end of a show. I hope you don't mind, Jason, but I bought you a present. Oh, and I was a bit sort of surprised. And it was the Penguin book of a Penguin. If you don't know, if you're from outside the UK, Penguin is a publishing house. Okay, just rather than a book about or for penguins, written by penguins for penguins. It was a Penguin book of Norse mythology. And inside, he'd written a very nice thing, sort of saying that he was obviously going through stuff in his life. And he happened to come along to one of my shows for some reason. Wasn't a traditional storytelling audience, and he loved how storytelling and coming along to see my shows had reminded him of, I think, the wonders of childhood, but also in the context of being an adult, which is very sweet and a lovely thing to hear. And one of those things is unintended consequences. You think, oh, great! It's not just did you like the stories, was it okay? But these other things were there. And so eventually at some point I thought, do you know, I need a new show. And I thought, oh, I'll go and get that book. And I started reading the stories. And I thought, oh, these are quite good, actually. And these are quite easy to tell and easy to play with. And I think it helps that I've been told that I can pronounce the Old Norse well enough for people who speak modern Scandinavian languages to be able to understand or to be able to hear what they mean. So, okay, I've got that right. Good. And I think I like Norse myths because the pantheon of gods in there are very, very human. They're much more like us than perhaps other pantheons of gods, which are super, super, superhuman. We all know that the Norse gods are superhuman and they do incredible things and they die and come back to life and they do magic and they have all these incredible feats. But at the same time, the way they act and the way they think is very relatable. So I think there's a nice thing about telling those stories to audiences, that the audiences can really relate to the successes, failures, problems, and sometimes horribly wrong ideas of the gods. And we can all get entertainment out of that, and we can all see the moral or whatever, if there is a message in the story as well. So I'd say the quick answer to your question is dark stuff, definitely dark stuff, dark magic-y fairy stuff. But also, yes, I've fallen into doing Norse stuff, and it seems to work, and people like it, so I enjoy it. So yeah, there's a lot to play with there.
I totally understand what you're saying, Jason, because I feel the same way about the Greek myths and the Greek gods. And there's nothing black or white. There's a lot of a huge gray area in between that people, mortals and gods move in. So people can relate to that. They don't see it as a high divinity nobody can reach.
Yes.
So,
I find in those kind of things, those stories or those legends, myths or religions, depending on where you are and which your relationship to them, when you get beyond a certain point, things become more ideas and concepts in sort of divine beings or gods, whereas the Norse and many other religions, it's great. We can all understand them when you can use this paradigms and metaphors for our lives and how we see things.
John Rose said that to me on the last occasion he watched me perform. That was at Match One Lock in October. He said, at the end of the gig, he said, I like the way you give these stories back to the people because they sound so much like human stories. And I said, well, John, they are. That is what they are actually,
Yes.
right? We may use
Yes.
gods in our heads or heroes or whatever, but what they really are is human constructions for people to feel better with themselves or to be taught a lesson or somehow. And this
Yeah.
stands for all ancient mythologies. Well, there is no such thing as a modern mythology, but for all mythologies, I'd say, before the duality of modern religions, this is how things were for people.
I think there's an interesting cultural thing here as well. I'm not quite sure, I don't have an end to this idea, but last night I was discussing with my partner and my son and her son, we were discussing EastEnders. Now, I don't know if you know the British soap EastEnders, but I know it's hugely popular here and it's been going, I think, since 1985 or something. And it's never going to end. It's going to go on until the Earth gets sucked into the sun. It's immortal. But when it was sold to the States, I think the people in the States just thought it was awful. It was dreary. It was dull. There was nothing happening. And we were discussing this last night. And we were saying, I think the popularity is there is a perceived realism for the people who really love it and can identify it. And of course, lots of cultural British things. It's very British. But people like it in that it is relatable. Oh, yes, I see this in my life, or I know that's happened, or I could see this happening, or this is a simulation. Whereas culturally, many countries have had, say, soap operas from the States, where they've been much more like Dallas and Dynasty, and it's all very pew, 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 pizzazz, pshoo. And it's that different idea that we can't identify with those people because they're fabulously rich and live these falsely complex lives that are entertaining and overly dramatic. But effectively, they both EastEnders and their kind of relatability and these kind of glitzy towers of glass and steel soap operas provide those same things for us about showing us excitement and drama, no matter how small it might be. But actually, EastEnders here in Britain, it's very, oh yes, we can see that. Oh, that's just like Denny down the road. Yeah, he's got that trouble, hasn't he? Yeah, and it becomes a reflection of reality. I've just compared the Greek and Norse gods to EastEnders, haven't I? Oh, that's it.
The modern way of expressing myths. And I was thinking that one thing I really, really like about the Norse mythology in particular is that whenever I hear somebody telling a Norse myth, or whenever I tell it, or whenever I read a book with Norse stories, one thing that comes to my mind is I can imagine those stories being told in the halls around the fire, and everybody laughing and being drunk with
Yeah,
ale. And when, for example, Loki comes up in the stories and he behaves like a trickster, as he always does, I can imagine the roars of laughter coming out, and the funny things that he does, they are alive. It's not something that I see as much with other kinds of mythology. So when I came to a show that you did, you were telling Norse myth, and it had the same feeling of being in a hall and being told stories, and the camaraderie, if we can call it like that, of being together and listening to a story as if we were around the fire and having fun together.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that when I talk to people about storytelling, if they kind of have an idea of what I'm talking about, the things they often say are, oh, wouldn't it be nice to sit around a fire and do that? Well, there is that sort of idea, that nostalgia for bringing everybody sort of back together into a sort of a microcosm of experience where everyone can sit around a fire, that elemental sort of thing, and be told stories. My only problem with sitting around fires is I find that as walking around as a storyteller is the smoke always follows me. So, and I was actually telling Norse stories up in a place in the Lake District in the northwest of England, where there's a lovely place where a guy has built a Viking longhouse that takes about 40 people sitting. He's now building a much bigger one, and he found that when he built it, the floor flooded because, of course, it's just an earthen floor. It flooded because of the land that was underneath it, and so he had to raise the floor, I think, with gravel, and I don't know how he did it. Clever building things, but it meant that it ended up being dry and solid. It raised it by about 30 centimeters, and so when I'm performing in there, there are wooden beams that are at my forehead height. So I can't really move very much in it. I can move side to side, but not forwards and back, otherwise I clonk my head. And also the smoke comes up into the roof, and it doesn't have a big chimney. It has a long fire trench down the middle, so you have quite a lot of smoke going up, and there are little slots in the ceiling that eventually it pours out of, but it comes down. And so I found that actually I was performing and telling stories with smoke halfway down my eyes, with my eyes sort of streaming, and trying not to cough. At the interval, some guy dressed up in traditional Viking gear just leant over as I'd kind of, after sort of people had finished clapping and started dispersing, and he just leant over and said, you're doing a grand job there, Jason, standing in that smoke. You're doing a grand job keeping going, so well done. And it was quite hard, yeah, because that's the reality of performing in places where it's smoky. But there's another place, a place called Butser Ancient Farm, which is an archaeological visitor centre. They have a Roman villa, a Saxon longhouse, a Neolithic longhouse, and all sorts of different things that have been constructed by archaeologists based on archaeological evidence. But they have a number of Iron Age roundhouses, which is just a room, just one room with a pointed, conical, thatched roof. And some of them are quite small, but the big one that I normally perform in seats 100 people and has a fire in the middle, a small fire. And thankfully, they always have dry wood. But that, deliberately, there is no chimney, there's no way for the smoke to get out in there. And that's deliberate. So what happens is it goes up about, oh, I don't know, I'm trying to do my metric to imperial conversions here as well. Sort of 20 feet, about 5-6 meters up. And then the smoke just hangs and comes down. So you can see above you, there is like a sort of sea of smoke, which is too high for me to reach, but it's up there. And of course, what that actually does for the house is it covers it in tar inside and waterproofs it and kills off insects and pests living in the roof. So that's what that would have done. And it's too big to fill the place with smoke. But that's great because you do that, and then suddenly, yes, the roof comes down part way through telling the story. So you've got this upside down sea of smoke hanging in the air above you with just one central fire, and everybody sat in the round about you. So that's a lovely environment to tell in.
Certainly better than having smoke in your eyes while telling.
Oh, yeah, so much, and just trying to keep going with it, and trying not to look like you're just going.
Getting emotional and telling Nordic tales, a bit weird.
Yeah. There is a story actually it's one of my stories called The Shield Maiden. That starts off with the death of a woman's husband and young daughter. When I tell that, I usually tell that as a second half story. It's a kind of a 3/4 of an hour story, I reckon. And in the first half, there's probably been a bit more fun and a bit more kind of, even if it's been terribly dark, it's been kind of, again, humorously dark. And then this starts off, and you can feel the audience kind of, I don't know, it's like feeling concrete setting or something. You know, you can feel the audience go quiet, and they suddenly realise, they go, okay, we thought the husband had died, but we didn't think he was going to kill the child, and now the child's dead, and what from here? And of course, you know, it ends up with a bittersweet ending. I won't give any spoilers, but there is a bittersweet ending. But yeah, I think there's still, even in those, what some might think of as macho stories, and there is a kind of a danger of, there are some elements of modern society that have co-opted some of the Norse legends for right-wing and misogynistic uses, which is not their original purpose at all. But there is emotion in all of those, even if there is blood and guts and big beards and hurrah and lots of beer going down as well.
I have been reading a book lately of a collection of Greek folk tales from 2 centuries ago, gathered by, I think it was an Englishman, I don't remember the name right now. Anyway, there was this researcher going around the Greek countryside a bit after the Greek Revolution or a bit earlier, around that 19th century, early 19th century. And I've been reading the stories I know, or, you know, older versions of them, and there is no way I could tell one of those stories exactly because of the place of women in them. And it's not like it is the purpose, as you said it, but it's just a reflection of the society of the era. This is how things were. In order to retell a story of that time, I'd have to reshape it totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was telling the fairy tale Bluebeard the other day, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's the same guy who, for those listening, if they've not heard it, if it's not written by, it was certainly written down by a Frenchman called Charles Perrault, who wrote down Red Riding Hood and Cinderella and Puss in Boots. But it's awful about a murderous man who has murdered all his previous wives and marries again and is about to murder his new wife. But in the version I've got, the new wife doesn't have a name. There are 2 sisters. The new wife just has no name. You know, they don't even bother to name her. I have to make a joke of it often and sort of say, and his new wife, who had no name because women hadn't been invented properly yet at the time. And I have to say things like that, you know, to point out the fact that I know that this isn't right, and I'm making fun of the fact that this woman doesn't have a name because the prevailing attitudes or whatever at the time.
That's even better than renaming her, I think. Better to point it out.
I feel like a fool now you've said that, yeah. I could have just given her a name.
Exactly the opposite. No, it was quite the clever thing to do, I think. There are little things storytellers can do. I have a friend, Keith Rogers. The traditional storytelling version is that you have the king who gives half his kingdom and his daughter's hand in marriage to the hero who will save them from a catastrophe or another. So what he does is, Keith always says, and the king says, you can have half my kingdom and you can ask my daughter to marriage.
Okay, nice.
He does give permission, but it's up to the woman really in Keith's versions. So
yeah, he's not selling her.
Exactly, not giving her away as spoil or whatever.
Yeah,
that's
classic fairy tale. Yeah,
exactly. Subtle things like that, details that storytellers can actually tamper with without actually destroying the story.
Yeah, absolutely. I know Keith. I'm gonna tell him you said that, and I'm gonna nick it. I'm gonna take that
Okay.
because it is nice because it does feel uncomfortable, and especially if I'm telling stories to children about princesses have to go off and do whatever, could be married or whatever. And I always kind of say, and but you don't have to do that. Let me just tell you, everyone, get married if you want to. You don't have to get married. But this is an old story, and this is what's happened in the old story. So we're going to go with this for the story, but you don't need to do that anymore. Again, so it's kind of, the kids are just like, yeah, okay. But it's also I think the adults are like, oh, okay, good. We might can pick that up later if we need to.
So speaking of stories and dark stories in particular, which I am very
Yeah.
fond of, is there any one particular story that is jumping out of your brain right now, Jason?
I think, yes. There's a story of mine called The Lost Lady of the Pines, which is a sort of dark fairy tale.
Oh, please, Jason, tell us the Lost Lady of the Pines.
There is a land far to the north and far to the east of here, where the summers are short and the winters are long and full of ice and snow, and forest covers everything. And in that land, there is a tradition that at certain times of the year, the dead are welcomed to that home or hearth. Not the dead as in those shambling corpses, the bones, the carriages of the soul, but the spirits and the shades of those who are yet to cross over, those who may still have purpose in this world or are deeply missed by those who are left behind. And at that certain time of the year, when the dead are welcomed in a home, a honeyed cake and a glass of strong spirits are left next to the hearth, next to the fire. Now some say this is a nice little tradition, a way of finding solace in grief and memory. But there are others who say that if a honeyed cake and a glass of strong spirits are left by the fire hearth, that in the morning the fire has been swept and a new fire laid that will burn longer and hotter than any that you or I could lay, and the drink and the cake are gone. But there are no honeyed cakes, no glasses of strong spirits for those who are not laid to rest with tears and prayers, those whose graves are not tended, those who are lost in the forest and lost forever. Lost like the young woman who on her wedding night, her husband killed as he lay in her arms, and she, still wearing her wedding gown, fled deep into the forest, deep into the forest, and was lost forever, her gown torn and taken to line the nests of crows, and her bones gnawed by foxes, pierced by tree roots, and clothed in green velvet moss, studded with garnet red mushrooms that soften and blacken among the quiet of the pines. Some time later, another young woman was on her way to be married to her betrothed, and she was travelling from her village to his village in the company of her father and her two brothers. But they were far from help when they were set upon by rogues, bandits, and thieves. And the men fought well. The men fought well to defend their sister, their daughter, to give her time to escape. And she ran into the forest. Deeper and deeper she ran into the forest, hearing the sounds of those men pursuing, baying like hounds behind her. Deeper and deeper she went, and the pillared trunks of the trees grew taller and taller and closer together as the forest got darker and darker, as hunter and hunted plunged into that wood's dark heart. The young woman tripped over a tree root at some point and found herself lying flat on her face. The feel of the pine needles in that deep carpet that smelt of pine and sap and resin. But what she didn't notice was, as she fell, her hand landed on a bone, a finger bone that still contained or carried a wedding ring, a woman's wedding ring. But as she scrambled to stand and continue her run, her hand closed around that bone and the ring, unthinking, and on she ran into the forest. But this time when she ran, clouds of mist and fog trailed behind her like the train of a wedding dress. And those following her, they didn't notice the fog. They didn't notice the mist that spun like gossamer across the forest floor. They didn't feel the unseasonable cold of that fog as it dragged its nails down their shins. But eventually, deep in the forest and at the foot of a ragged, rugged cliff, the young woman, exhausted, stopped and collapsed into that fog which poured back and washed back over her like the waves of the sea. And those men who had been chasing her, now they slowed and now they stopped, making a circle around where she had fallen, panting, grinning, looking forward to their prize. But the figure that stood up from that mist was not the woman they had been chasing. Oh no. This was a female form, and it was clad in mist and fog like a silk wedding dress clinging to its body. But her figure, her body was made of roots and vines, of rocks and moss and leaves, and the things that crawl and chitter within the leaf litter on the forest floor had combined to make a sketch of blood and bone and sinew and hair. If in life she had ever been beautiful, now she was terrible to look upon and a host to long-brooded vengeance. In the quiet of the forest, in that pregnant quiet, there was a squeak and a creak like the sound of autumn branches rubbing in a breeze as vines and roots rolled over one another to allow her to open wide her mouldered mouth. And then she screamed. And as she screamed, the horrors of the night poured out of her mouth. And the air was filled with the howling of wolves and the shrieking of bats and the fluttering of moths, and red-eyed, black-bodied rats poured from her jaw down her front like black sanguine. And those men who had not themselves run screaming into the forest to find their lonely fates, those who had remained behind, were not only held in place by fear, but were caught and entrapped by reaching roots that grew from the ground and spiraled up around their legs and around their bodies and held them tight and squeezed them. And as they did, the small creatures that lived in the holes of trees and in the floor, they came out and ravaged the flesh of those men as they cried out and screamed for their mothers. But as each of them was held there, this spectral figure in front of them processed towards them like a bride processing down the aisle of a church, and as she reached them, she kissed each of them in turn. A kiss that was filled with the sweetness of pine needles and leaf mould, as soft forest earth poured into their mouths and filled their throats. When the young woman woke, She was not far from the path she had left, and she was being cradled by her father, who was weeping with happiness at finding her. He had a makeshift bandage around his head, and she helped her back to where her brothers were resting and recovering. She couldn't remember how she'd got away. She couldn't remember where she'd run. And she couldn't remember where the ring had come from that was now on the finger next to her little finger of her left hand. But what she did know was that once she was married, very happily and very contentedly, and wearing her wedding ring alongside the forest ring that she always wore, what she did know was that her babies slept soundest than any other neighbour's babies, and on a certain night of the year, if a honeyed cake and a glass of strong spirits was left by the hearth by the fire, then in the morning that hearth had been swept, and the fire that had been laid there would burn hotter and longer than any fire you or I could lay, and the cake and the drink were gone, and no wolf, no monster, no man ever came out of that forest to bother that village for a whole generation. Thank you.
Lovely.
The Lost Lady of the Pines. There we go. That's her name.
Where does this story come from?
Well, it's one of mine, and
Okay.
this was actually, I don't know if you've ever heard of LARP, live action role play. So it's like Dungeons and Dragons, for those who don't know, like playing Dungeons, you dress up and run around in the field. It's a bit like reenactment, but sort of fantasy stuff. And I used to go along to one, and the character I played was part of a group that was sort of very sort of dark fairy tales, Black Forest, Eastern European forest sort of nations, that sort of part of the world was the idea behind them. And somebody said, we need a ghost story. We need a ghost story, and it has to be only so many words. And I wrote The Lost Lady of the Pines in response to that, and it was double the amount of words. They said, that's really good, but it's too big. We can't use it. It was going to go onto the website or something to do with the organisation that runs all the games for that. And so I just wrote it, and I liked it, and she's stayed with me forever. I've self-published a number of books of my own stories, and the very first one I did is called Stories from the Woods and Wild Places, and that story's in there. And the reason I self-published those books was, in fact, it was one of my very first shows, professional shows, because I suddenly realised I'd written a whole bunch of stories and illustrated them, and I thought, oh, I've got a show here. And so I took them from these lovely big handwritten books that my late father had made, with calligraphy, had written them in and then illustrated them as well. So I just sat there, typed them up, and then scanned the images in and cleaned them up on the computer. And so I ended up with the book of stuff. And the picture of her, the kind of the forest spirit, she has no name, but the Lost Lady of the Pines. It's a kind of a double page picture. She's sort of standing there made of wood and branches and things, surrounded by curling mist fog that is suggestive of a wedding gown. But that was the inspiration, where someone said, I need a ghost story and it's got to happen, sort of something, dark foresty. And so she popped into my head. And I've been told actually that some of the people who still do those games, because at those games it's anywhere between sort of 50 people and 3,000, depending on the events, small events and big events. But on one of the smaller ones, when there were about 50, 70 people, they'd asked my permission, and they took that story and made it into a weekend event. So they brought the mythology to life, and people then went through, and that story was woven through all the events that happened, like a murder mystery sort of thing, but out in the woods. And it's a shame, I wish I'd gone along to see what they did with it. But it's nice to know that that had been taken and then brought to life, that people actually lived that story.
That's wonderful. And now that you mentioned that you self-published your books, so that you illustrated them, this thought just came up to my mind that you wrote a book together with Amy Douglas, with illustrations and stories and riddles. And I saw that you collaborate a lot with Amy Douglas and also with Kat Edwards. And
Yes,
I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about all
sure.
that you do with them, for example.
Yeah, okay. So Kath's probably the easiest. We occasionally do stuff, Kath and I. I'm not really sure how we ended up doing stuff. I can't quite remember, but we did. And we actually did a murder mystery last year. We created a murder mystery and we ran a pilot of it. And so we're sort of seeing if we can find places to do that this year, which is great fun. It's not strict storytelling, but it's partly improvisational acting. We're using all our storytelling skills either in our creation of a narrative for what's actually happening in the background, and then all the clues that we create to give to people, because they work it all out. It's not just us performing in front of them, it's an interactive thing. I play Inspector Gruff, who's the classic stupid policeman who wants to solve the murder but hasn't got it right and always gets it wrong. And Kath plays the character she's invented is Miss Christie Marbles, which is Agatha Christie and Miss Marple, who's one of her detective characters, together. So she plays the terribly nice lady who's wandering around with tea, whilst I'm the stupid, And it's a nice kind of double act. It kind of a nice way we can bounce off each other. But we've done lots of other stuff together, lots of other shows in person or online. But yeah, I can't quite remember how we first did a thing together. I can't remember now, but there we go. It all worked out. It's all very good. Amy Douglas, I moved to the county of Shropshire a couple of years ago after I moved away from the county of Sussex. I just happened to see a Facebook profile pop up, and in the little, profile picture was a thing that said Shropshire Folk Tales. And that was Amy Douglas's book that she's done with the History Press. And I thought, I've heard of her. I've watched her on TV, or not TV, on YouTube or Zoom or something. I thought, she's quite good. And so I just sent her, as I often do with things, that, hello, I've just moved to the area and I'm a storyteller. Would you like to meet up for coffee and cake? And she said, yes. And so we went and chatted and, we got on. And we did a few shows together. And then it was Amy Douglas's suggestion that we do a monthly thing together, which we did through 2024. We started, I think, in March. Actually, we started a bit late in the year, and we do that for online shows. So every month we do an online show. I'm not sure when this is going out, but there's one in March which is Out Like a Dragon, In Like a Hare. So that's to celebrate St David's Day and the patron saint of Wales, and the Welsh flag is the dragon, and of course March hares. But there'll be ones for April going through. So we always choose stories, whatever we want to tell. We just make sure we agree that we're not telling the same ones. That's about it. And then whether we've got any extra folklore or riddles and things. We run a Patreon site as well called A Tale for All Seasons. That's A Tale for All Seasons. That's A Tale for All Seasons. Then for our paying Patreons, and people pay like sort of £3.50, which is about €3.50 roughly, up to sort of something higher, and people get discounts either for tickets and things. But we also say we will produce at the end of the year a journal, which we did at the end of last year, and some of our patrons at the higher end get free journals and other people always get a discount. But the journal itself the idea was, to begin with, when you say it's a book that for people to write and sketch into, so to journal or a sketchbook, so effectively it's an empty book. It's an empty book. We're selling people an empty book. But also we can't do that. That's just some pieces of paper. So as well as having all the phases of the moon through all the different days of the year, we've also picked out some of the more fun celebratory days, things like National Porridge Day and International Penguin Day and stuff and things like that. So there's some fun stuff there. But also dotted through there's riddles, and at the beginning of every month there's a bit of flower folklore, but also a story, and it'll be one of the stories we had told that month, and it's that story which I've then illustrated. So we wrote the material together, and then I illustrated and put the book together, and yes, we produced that for the end of last year. They are still available if really coming up to March people really want to get a journal, but you can come and shout at me and I can tell them where to get it. That's A Tale for All Seasons. But yeah, so that's great fun. So we do that. It's a good excuse to do things every month together.
So we're not exactly sure when this is coming up, probably a couple of months later on in the year, but people could still get the calendar, throughout the year. It wouldn't be just for the moon phases, it would be for the stories, actually.
Precisely, yes. 6 months full of wonder and 12 months full of stories. Yeah, it's fun. And of course, we'll be doing one at the end of this year as well. Although we'll get on it a bit earlier this year because last year was a bit... I had to run quite fast to keep up with. We suddenly realised, because we're both obviously doing other stuff all the time, and then getting together to make sure we do things, and then you have to order the proof copy to make sure it looks right. And then to do all the stuff to the publishing things and get it all uploaded and whatnots and things and read through it and then realise there's an extra page there, you've written something ridiculous or, yes.
A little bit of something ridiculous would just add to it, really. So where could people find these calendars, Jason?
If you go to lulu.com, that's LULU.com, and for those people who are fans of the 1960s singer Lulu from Way, You Make Me Want to Shout, then you go to lulu.co.uk, and they're two very different websites. But lulu.com, and if you search for me, Jason Buck, or run Jason Buck Storyteller, you should find me as an author, and actually you'll find almost all my books, including that one, on there as well. So that's lulu.com, LULU.com.
Excellent.
Do you like my QVC radio announcer's voice that I'm doing?
I wanted to ask about books and your illustration skills. How did you get those?
Well, I think I've always doodled and I've always drawn. And then when I was doing my exams when I was 16, it was quite clear that I should definitely do sciences and computing and things like that. Because, well, art you can always do later, can't you? Well, there's no good having an art qualification. Even though both my parents were kind of very arty people. And when it became quite clear quite quickly, actually, that I didn't have that much of an aptitude for science. And even though I like facts, and even though I like science and popular science, I'm not very good at the actual discipline of science. It was too late for me to change at 16. So I did a bunch of exams there, and then went on to 18 and signed up to do A-levels, they're called in Britain, so the ones you do when you're 18. That's the advanced wizarding level, if you're Harry Potter fans. And originally I was going to do business studies, psychology and biology. And then I changed psychology to economics. And then I started economics and hated it and changed that to mathematics and statistics and really hated that and left at the end of the first term. And then started again the next year doing human biology, photography and theatre studies, because I wasn't any good at chemistry, the biology bit. I was really interested in animal behaviour, but not in the biochemistry and stuff, and I wasn't very good at that. So I ended up doing 3 A-levels, theatre studies, which I failed, photography, which I just passed, and art, which I just passed. And the irony being there is that I've worked, I think, in all those industries since then, and done better than just passing. I failed my English literature exam when I was 16, and now I write books and, I go into schools and do performances and teach kids about Shakespeare and stuff. I wasn't good at essays. People didn't explain to me I didn't get how an essay should be written until I was about 20. And then I got it and went, oh, okay, right, okay, that's why you want me to do extra. Otherwise, I've answered your question in 200 words. What's the problem? So you asked me about illustration. So I did all those things, and then of course it was really put off stuff. But then just started drawing things, and people started liking what I was drawing and the style I was drawing. And I've got a sort of slightly woodcut style that's very much sort of, I tend to draw in pencil, and then I go over in a fine liner, in a fibre tip pens, and I might use paint or other fibre tip pens to colour or give accents and things. So it's quite a sort of primitive style, but it's very much a kind of woodcut sort of style rather than being a paintery style. And I've just fallen into that, and people seem to like them.
I remember a photo you had put up somewhere, I think it was on Instagram, where you were obviously illustrating one of the new books or new projects you're working on. And there was this wonderful calligraphy of the first letter like we used to see in ancient scripts.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I do a lot of that. I know this isn't going to be any good for audio, but you could try and perhaps you guys can try and describe something. This is a project I'm working on at the moment. So this is a book I've bought. For those listening, it's just a sort of leather-bound notebook with rough paper that I bought very cheaply off eBay and went round someone's house to pick up. It's the story, one of mine called Homunculus, which is a modern magic story about a single middle-aged man who wants to have a child. It starts off with illuminated letters, as you'd say in English, dear listeners. It starts off with the words once upon a time, and the O it's a picture from my clumsy copy of a picture by Leonardo da Vinci. And it's part of one of his anatomical drawings of a baby in the womb. But as this book goes through, I faked up some Polaroids of. It's supposed to be like the guy's diary. This is supposed to be the diary of the man as he talks through the story, because the story is written in such a way that it's first person, and there's just little illustrations all the way through, and it's all sort of calligraphed. Oh, there we go, there's another one there. So an illuminated letter and other little sort of illustrations in there as well. So there's my little illustration of Pinocchio.
Is that a skeleton around the P?
If I bring it closer, what do you think it looks
It's a
like now?
spiral. It's like a
It's a
DNA.
DNA.
Yeah, DNA spiral, deoxyribose nucleic acid. See, I know that sort of thing, but I wouldn't be able to tell you what it was composed of. So that story goes on and on. But yes, so I like to illustrate the stuff going through there. There's a sort of cutaway human anatomical sort of drawings, as if it's a little bit like a Frankenstein picture or an alchemist's, an old alchemist, an old grimoire, one might say. But it's not quite so entertaining for people listening on audio. But you guys.
Yeah,
You guys
okay,
can
people
see
can
it.
get the picture. It's not just calligraphy of the first letter in a much larger font than the rest.
Yeah.
It's an actual picture
Yes,
within
just like
the letter.
like a monk's illuminated letter. There is a cat that's important to this story, and so on one of the pages, I've made it look like the cat has walked across the edge of the page with slightly smudged paw prints.
So you didn't use the actual cat to do this?
No, I don't think I could have done that. I don't have an actual cat anymore, unfortunately. He died a little while back, but there we go,
no.
Percy. But there we go. So I do things like that, I think, because they please me and it helps me. I wanted to become a storyteller, not because I wanted to get rich, but because I love writing, I love researching, and I love telling stories, and I love doing those. And I've had jobs in the past where I've earned plenty of money, and they did not make me happy. And I spent all the money I earned on, not to sound dramatically like to make myself happy in a sad world, but to kind of just to, because you've got all that money there, so I don't have anything to show for the stuff that I used to do and the money I used to earn. Whereas now, I'm doing things that bring me joy, make me a happier person in myself. And whilst I have to work quite hard, I work 7 days a week most of the time. I work on 7 days a week. I'm not doing 8 hours a day every day, but I work on 7 days a week. And a lot of that is all publicity and finding places where I can take a new show and do things, because that, I think, is makes the difference, and is why I've got a full calendar of things. Because I don't do storytelling festivals. Storytelling festivals don't tend to ask me to come along. There's only one once, and that was because Amy Douglas asked me to come along. But I think it's because I haven't come up in the traditional route of perhaps going through storytelling clubs. And this summer, 2025, I'm doing one Viking festival, one pagan festival, Druids festival, and a fantasy forest sort of thing, which is a lot of kind of dressing up and stuff off films. But I'm taking storytelling to those non-traditional storytelling audiences who actually would love storytelling, but they're just not exposed because they're not in that scene. They're in the films, TV, comics, streaming media, gaming sort of fantasy scene, which is all about all the stuff that we have in our stories. But the two worlds seem to be weirdly disparate.
Yeah, both Simona and I know what you mean, because in our minds, education and storytelling used to be two different things some time ago, where now it is intertwined.
Yes, yeah. When I was in Italy, I tried to get someone to translate the word storyteller. Maybe Simona, you could do a better job, but someone came up as the canto di something, historia, maybe something like that.
Storyteller, I think we've got one term that does not represent the storyteller in English. We've got
Yeah,
canta storie. Cantare means to
to
sing.
sing. Yeah,
So it takes from the bardic tradition, I think, of
yeah,
the bard going into chorus with a lyre or something and
yes,
singing stories more than telling stories.
yes.
Which, when I describe myself in Italian as a cantastorie, people say, "Oh, so you sing
You're a
stories?" And
singer.
I'm like, "No,
Yeah,
I tell stories."
yeah, yeah.
But yeah,
Maybe a better
so
term would be something like, I don't know if the word exists, I'll just try some storytelling manufacturing here. Is there something like a narratore or something?
yes,
Yeah,
Narrazione?
yeah,
narratore, yes,
Narratore.
that could be one, or racconta storie.
Mm.
But the term that we use the most is canta storie.
yeah. That was what he said. Yeah,
I
not
think,
canto
yeah.
story, canto story. Yeah. And I still think, certainly in Britain, when I tell people a story, I'm a storyteller, that most people are confused and they don't understand. And if they were to make assumptions as to what they think I do, it would probably be either reading books aloud or sitting in the corner of the children's section of the library and reading the Gruffalo from the book upside down to a seated group of half a dozen small people.
The same misconception goes around the whole continent, I think, because, it is
Yeah.
a traditional art. It's just a few decades that it's been lost to the collective subconscious. It's still there
Yeah.
if we just remind people.
Yeah. Even in the arts, I think, because somebody said to me, "Oh, would you like to come and be part of blah blah festival for in our town?" I said, "Well, that sounds very interesting." Yes, and she said, "Yes, so we'll have a gazebo put up in the market square, and you can sort of be in there, and the children can sort of come and go." And I thought, no, the market square on market day will be absolutely full of people backwards and forwards. No, that's. I mean, yeah, I mean, could. But they obviously didn't have any idea. It was like, no, what I want is a venue for 40, 50 people upwards, and I can. It could be in a pub theatre, the upstairs of pubs, or anything like that. But she was a kind of like a, why would you do that kind of face of yeah. So it was. It also meant I decided not to be part of that festival as well because they obviously had absolutely no idea what storytelling that I meant was, and it was just a children's entertainment.
So, Jason, as time is passing, can I ask for a little story to see us off with?
Yes. Okay. I tell you what, I'll do. One of the things that people often comment about stories that I do is voices and sound effects. And I will do one of my favourite sound effect stories. So, guys listening at home, just so you know, this is me doing the voices and sound effects. If you could see me, you'd realise my mouth is moving along with it. I did tell this story once in public, and there were some friends of mine in the audience. One friend turned to the other and said, "Oh, it's really clever the way he kind of manages to match up what he's telling with the recording." And then the other friend said, "There's no recording, it's just him doing that." So, yeah. So,
Is there this pop-up wine bottle and wine being poured into a glass in the
there
side or
isn't, but
not?
there isn't, but would you like me to do that
Could
before I
we
start?
have a little sample? Yes, please.
Yeah, of course. So we can. Those of you at home, you can imagine I'm sitting in a leather wing-backed armchair by the side of a crackling fire in a stately home in England. I mean, I'm not, but you can imagine that. And so I've just got this wonderful bottle of wine here. So I'll just uncork it, and I'll just pour myself a glass here. Oh, just one more drop. There we go, into the glass. Once upon a time, there was a miser. The word miser seems to have gone out of fashion. So if you don't know what a miser is, it is a mean person, a person who hoards their money, who hoards their possessions. If you think of Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol, he is a miser. And once upon a time, there was a miser, a particular miser, and he lived in a house, a very big house. But he lived there alone, and he didn't really use all the rooms. In fact, he only really used 2 rooms. And in those 2 rooms, he kept the things that he loved. There was the room upstairs, that when he went upstairs, he went into there, and that was where he kept his money. Not money in terms of notes or paper. Of course, this was money in coins, just like a cartoon. And he would count it every day. And every day, there was a little bit more money. And then he would go downstairs into the other room, where he would sit and indulge in his other love, and that love was music. Now, he had a gramophone. Now, again, gramophones are things of the past, but you will have probably seen a gramophone if you don't know what one is. And if you can imagine a vinyl record that goes round and round and round and round on a turntable, and up above it is a great big sort of huge trumpety horn thing, that is a gramophone. And when he would go down, he would put the record on, and he would wind it up, and he would put the needle on, and it would begin to play beautiful music. That, if you didn't recognise it, is beautiful music. And life was fine for a while, but one day the miser, after going upstairs, counting his money, there was a little bit more, and then coming downstairs into the other room, he went to listen to his music, and he wound it up. It had stopped working. He tried to wind it up again, but it had broken. So he went down to the town, and he went to the shop wherever you buy your audio equipment and listening devices. And he went and he said, "I would like a new gramophone, please." And the man in there said, "We don't have new gramophones here, Grandad." And he said, "Well, what do you have?" "This," said the man, producing a very small device, the same size as a postage stamp. He said, "This is an MP3 player." "Well, how does it work then?" He said, "You simply press this button, and music comes out, and it can store thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of music on it." "How wonderful," said the miser. "How much is it?" And the man told him, and he said, "Disgusting. I'm not paying that amount of money. Forget it." And instead, he went down to the orphanage. He went down to where the orphans live, and he said to them, "I would like a young boy, please, to come and live at my house, and he will work for me, and I will give him somewhere to sleep, and I will feed him." And so a young boy came home with the miser, and the miser got him to wind the gramophone when it wound down. So now it went. And it worked. For a bit. Small boys get quickly bored of dull jobs. And so, to make sure that the boy wound the gramophone, the miser went back down to the town, and he went to the dog pound. He went to doggy death row. And he said, "I would like a dog, please. I would like a dog that is not actually dangerous, but that is very large and has a very savage bark." And the man at the dog pound said, "How about this one?" And the miser said, "Yes, that's perfect. I'll take that." So he took the dog back, and now it went like this. And it worked for a bit. But small boys make good friends with big dogs, and the dog stopped barking at the small boy, and so the miser went back to the town and back to the orphanage, and he said, "I would like a young woman, please, to come and work for me, and I will give her somewhere to sleep and food and shelter." And so a young woman came home, and he said, "Here is a stick. When the dog doesn't bark, when the boy doesn't whine, I want you to beat the dog." And so now it went like this. Oh, well, that did work after a fashion, I suppose. But now he found that with a small boy and a young woman and a big dog, well, he had to grow more food in his gardens to feed them. And to look after the house, he decided to hire a housekeeper. And so while the housekeeper was inside, looking after the house and cooking food for the young woman and the small boy, and the big dog had the scraps, well, the miser was outside growing vegetables and buying things that he needed. And well, one day he went up to his counting room and he counted his money and found that today there was less than there had been yesterday. And the day after that there was a little less, and the day after that there was a little less, and he suddenly found that he was paying an awful lot for a housekeeper, a young woman, a small boy, and a big dog. And so he fired his housekeeper, he sent the young woman and the small boy back to the orphanage, and he took the dog back to doggy death row. He got rid of the gramophone and went back down to the town and went to the audio shop and said, "I'll take that MP3 player, please." And he brought it home and he played it. The man had been right. Hours and hours of absolutely perfect music, without a scratch, without a crackle, without a drop, without a repeat. Oh, it was wonderful. But there was something missing. There was something missing, he realised, and even though his money was growing every day, things weren't quite as much fun. And he realised that he'd actually, whilst he loved his music and loved his money, he'd also grown to love having people around him. And so he went down to the town, and he adopted the small boy, and he adopted the young woman as his son and daughter. He went back to the doggy death row, but unfortunately the dog had been killed by that point. No, of course it hadn't. There was the dog. There was the dog, and he took the dog home with him. And for completeness, and because this is a fairy tale, he got in touch with his housekeeper and said, "I have a son and a daughter and a large dog." And he said, "And we seem to get on." He said, "Would you like to marry me?" And she said, "Well, that accelerated quickly." And she said, "But because it is a fairy tale, and we did get on very well, and because you've asked me so nicely, well, yes, well, why not?" And so the miser married his housekeeper. They shared their son and their daughter and their big dog, and they listened to their music. And you know what? He still loved his money, he still loved his music, but now he loved his family as well, and they all lived happily ever after.
That was a wonderful, wonderful story to end with. I
Thank
think
you.
it was just marvelous.
I love the hearts flooding up through your screen, Despina. That was good. I don't know how to do that. Thank you, guys. Grazie mille.
Grazie a te. Thank you for your time and for being with us. It was marvelous, really.
Thank you for asking me. It's been great. It's been a great fun morning. Thank you.
Thank you kindly, and you have a brilliant day now, Jason.
And you. Okay, guys. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.